Let me ask you a question. Do you want to become Prime Minister of Canada? If you said yes, let me ask you a follow-up. Does the prospect of trying to convince 6 to 10 million people to vote for your party seem like a lot of work? If you're lazy like me, you'd want to know, how can I become Prime Minister by convincing the fewest people possible? Well, never fear, your Canadian guide is here, and I'm going to show you how to become Prime Minister of the second largest country in the world with as little as 5% of the votes, or only 2 million. I know it's still a lot, but hey, come on. Americans and CGP Grey eat your heart out with that 22% threshold for US presidency. Want to see me do it? Well, remember that in Canada, the Prime Minister is the person who can convince a majority of the members of Parliament, or MPs, to say, yeah, sure, I guess you can have the job. And while that technically means you can get elected as an independent and convince MPs to back you, that means you need to get other parties to support you, and I don't know about you, but I'd like to rule with an iron fist. So I want to have my party win a majority, or 170 seats, so I can cram whatever I want through the House of Commons. Here is a map of all 338 constituencies, or ridings as we call them in the country birthed by France and Britain. Now while you may think that since we are a democracy that everybody's vote is equal, I'm sure by now you know how silly that is. Partially for historic and cultural reasons, some votes are a bit more equal than others, by design. Some by a lot, like a lot. Since the new map with 343 seats won't be used until April 1st, 2024, and given how unstable the current Liberal NDP arrangement is, the next election is likely also going to be using the outdated 2012 map. So for that reason, I am sticking to it, and I'll be using the 2021 census numbers to figure out which voters I am to woo and which I am to avoid because they're just not worth my time. Not because they're bad people, but because I want the laziest and most efficient route to a majority. It's called working smart, not hard, people. I swear if I see this post on my Instagram one more time, I'm going to... So, to figure out who is worthy of my attention, I will list all 338 ridings by population to show you how absolutely nuts some of these differences are. But to keep the suspense for now, I will be withholding some of their names so we can have the joy of revealing them together. Look at that list fly. Don't worry, we're not going to go through all of them one at a time. So which provinces will be part of my grand coalition, and which will be snubbed? Here we go, ready? If I had to give you 3 guesses to name the riding with the fewest number of people, and therefore at the top of my list to pitch woo to, where would you guess? You're wrong. I know, me too. I'm at least 80% sure that 2/3 of you guessed Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, and then Yukon. Probably in that order. Turns out, to my surprise as well, it's actually Labrador. As in the and Labrador in Newfoundland and Labrador. Only 26,655 people lived there in 2021, down a few hundred from 5 years prior. That's like how many people are stuck at Pearson Airport at any given time. So if we want to take over with the fewest votes possible, we are going to have to start with Labrador. Oh, and I should mention that the other ridings in Newfoundland also make the top 170 rather easily, so good for Newfoundland. Okay, so where on this list is everybody's first guess? Nunavut. The territory the size of Mexico with half the population of Fredericton. Well, it turns out they're actually number 3 on the list and are surrounded by all 4 of PEI seats. Despite having a population equal to Banff Airdrie in Alberta, they get a whopping 4 seats instead of 1. Seems fair to me. Why? Because when PEI joined Confederation in 1873, their population was relatively larger than it is now. Of course, since then, that relativity has done nothing but decline. This caused them to first lose a seat in 1896 and then again in 1904. Both these moves angered the Islanders so much they swam for Ottawa and argued Canada broke the deal they made when entering Confederation. Arguments the Supreme Court responded to by telling them, "Yeah, no, you're not that special, go away." Feeling just a wee bit bad for them, Sir Robert Borden called up the UK in the middle of World War I to amend the Constitution in 1915 so that no province could have fewer seats in the House than in the Senate. In PEI's case, that was 4, and thus 154,000 people get 4 votes rather than 2. And in case you were wondering, yes, PEI gets 4 senators, and BC, with 33 times the population, gets only 6 senators. I would say this is a major injustice if the Senate actually meant anything anymore. Moving on. In order to become Supreme PM with the fewest votes possible, we have taken over Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island, and Nunavut. Whoops. Let me just rearrange them to scale for once. There we go. And then we go and we take the other 2 obvious suspects, the Northwest Territories and Yukon. So now our fan club stands at 2 whole provinces and 3 territories. So who else is going to join us? Is that Ontario I see? I'm just kidding, it's not Ontario. At least not yet. Well, who said that? It's actually, not so surprisingly, another Atlantic province. Woo! Miramichi and Madawaska in New Brunswick take the next spot. Oh, and here's a seat in Hamilton West Dundas, just for comparison. Turns out, New Brunswick is the only other province to hit the senatorial minimum, in their case, 10. So, for those keeping track, the province with the population of Winnipeg gets almost twice the number of senators as any Western province. I mean, why would anybody have a problem with this? But this helps us in our goal of winning with the fewest votes possible, so let's add all 10 to the list. Though I should confess Moncton is pretty far down the list and is at a respectable 100,000 people. And what about that final Atlantic province? Nova Scotia. Home to that one island where a group of people with way too much time and a network with too much money are always just one episode away from finding the Holy Grail or the real Mona Lisa or something, I don't know. Well, you won't be surprised to know that all but one of Nova Scotia's seats are on Santa's wish list this year. That one exception being Halifax West, which only barely misses the cutoff. So saying that all of Atlantic Canada's seats are needed isn't really that far off the mark. So yeah, those who join Confederation early get better treatment in terms of vote to seat ratio. And then of course there's Newfoundland and Labrador, who played hard to get for 80 years. They also got a pretty good deal. But just before you think it's all over for Western Canada, let me introduce you to Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Yeah, they're pretty high up on the list there. Like here, 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 and also here. That's all of Saskatchewan's seats and 13 out of 14 seats in Manitoba. So stop complaining. Unless you happen to live in Winnipeg South. Then you get to complain a little bit. Too bad though. I was looking forward to speaking at St. Norbert's Community Centre, but now that I know that they aren't the most efficient way to a majority, I will unfortunately have to decline that invitation. My time will not be wasted. So if you're dead mouse living in Milton, you can sleep easy in your ridiculous outfit knowing that your vote counts for half of somebody living in Cypress Hill Grasslands, which is famous for, checks notes, having the first interprovincial park, which I guess is something to be proud of, as well as the best named town in all the prairies. Climax, Saskatchewan, a place I have never been to, and more disappointingly, have never taken anybody else to. Because it's in the middle of nowhere, you gutter people. But wait, go back to the list. I think we skipped one. Enhance. Who is this little one who slipped by? It can't be a territory or in Atlantic Canada. Where is this? Wait a minute. It's a riding in Ontario? What? That's right, Ontarians. Time for you to shut your pie holes and stop throwing Atlantic Canada and the prairies under the bus for unfair representation. Your province gets a whopping 38 seats on the list. That's more than most provinces have in total. But I should point out that's only 1/3 of Ontario's total. Despite 38 ridings being overrepresented enough to be on my list, only 13 have fewer than a 6-figure population, and 7 having fewer than 90,000. So even when Ontario is overrepresented, it ain't by much. I guess this is what happens when you have a province of 15 million people. Now, let's go back to these 7 seats with fewer than 90,000 people. You can probably already guess where they are. Let me tell you. Northern Ontario, Northern Ontario, Northern Ontario, Northern Ontario, wait for the twist, just kidding, Northern Ontario, Northern Ontario, and, wait for it, Northern Ontario. See, if you don't know much about Ontario, let me say that yes, there are 15 million people in this province. And yes, the province is twice the size of Spain. But less than 1 million live in the north. The north is essentially the place that Toronto goes camping and turns inside out for rocks and minerals. It's also the place most people plan on moving if climate change and pollution ever make the south uninhabitable. I mean, what? Smog in Toronto? Get out of here. And yes, you probably should merge some of these ridings together to get a more fair representation. But not to be too unfair to those people living in the north, if you were to merge Kenora and Timmins James Bay together in order to get a population closer to that of, say, Guelph, Ontario, I would dare you to look me in the eye and say that one representative covering more than 500,000 square kilometers is in fact a local representative, which, need I remind you, is the whole foundation of our parliamentary system. For context, this new riding would be the size of France, the metropolitan one. So we shall have to add the 38 seats that are overrepresented from Ontario to the list. Shockingly enough, this includes several from Toronto and the GTA. I'm not kidding, this took me by surprise. For example, our Whistle Stop tour will be taking us to Brampton Centre, but we are going to completely ignore voters in the literally adjacent Brampton West. That's what happens when you have 162,000 people. That's like 40,000 more than your neighbor. You can thank thousands upon thousands of single-family homes being built over the last decade for that. I mean, look, Elections Canada hasn't even updated the map. Here, let me go ahead and help you with that. There we go. This is what freedom looks like, people. Okay, folks, we are getting out of the suburbs, not just bikes hates, and closer to our finish line. I can taste it. 99 seats so far, just 71 to go. And I think you can guess where most of the seats are going to come from going forward. Yeah, there's no prize for guessing this correctly. Or as I should be saying, correctement, oui oui. If you know anything about Quebec politics since the 70s, you will not be surprised to hear that 46 seats are overrepresented enough to be on my love list to try and win over. Finally, we can reveal the identity of the last redacted riding on this list. Yeah, I don't know where that is either. And here's all of them, just in case you're curious. Guys, can we chill with like the 3 or 4 hyphenated names? Like, I feel like we need a rule, no more than 2. Thanks. Back in 2012, when we last did the major upgrade to the House of Commons, Quebec went from 75 seats to 78, but was warned that they could lose those new seats if their population didn't keep pace with the rest of the country. Since then, they elected 2 different governments that, well, shall we say, have interesting views on immigration? And on your religion? So it really shouldn't surprise you that after the 2021 census, Quebec was actually supposed to lose a seat. Immediately, panic ensued. The fighter jets were scrambled. The bureaucrats ran out into the streets all over Ottawa. The parliament buildings themselves began to tremble as the rocks they were made from actually appeared to crack upon hearing the news. I mean, other provinces had lost seats before, but Quebec had only ever lost one, which they gained back 10 years later. I mean, what did this mean? Existential questions were going to have to be asked in Quebec about the implications of some aspects of their laws. Oh, Justin Trudeau just passed a law to guarantee nobody ever loses his seat again? Yeah, so Justin Trudeau kind of just decided that, nah, from now on, nobody will ever lose a seat. So if Ontario's housing prices drive people out, or Alberta's oil runs out and people begin to leave, you get to keep all the seats you had. Bet you weren't expecting that prediction. And check. If you want to apply that logic to the US presidential election for a moment, that means New York would still have their 47 electoral college votes from the 1940s instead of the 28 they're going to have in 2024. Anyways, we shall add the 46 seats from Quebec to our side of the aisle, which brings us up to 145 out of a needed 170. So what do we do now? Could it be? Will we get all of the provinces and territories on our side? Will we not have to snub anyone? Was I previously trying to bait you there with this picture? Did I get anyone? Did I just fan the flames of regional tension for views? Oops. Well, it turns out we will be going everywhere since only 14 seats from BC make our list. And you know what that means? 11 will come from Alberta! Coming from the province that complains consistently about being unfairly treated, there are a whopping 11 seats on this list. I know, I was a little surprised too. For example, there are people living in Yellowhead riding with just under 100,000 people. Never heard of Yellowhead, Alberta? Yeah, me neither. Turns out it's the riding that contains Jasper, aka the place with more or less the same mountains as Banff, but far fewer tourists because we literally cannot be bothered to make the slightly longer, but arguably more scenic, drive to get there. If you take the seats we need to get to the PM's chair as fast as possible and divide them by the total seat count, Alberta finishes just ahead of BC and just behind Ontario in terms of unfair treatment. In fact, out of the 10 most underrepresented ridings in Canada, 4 are in Alberta and 6 are in Ontario. In fact, Quebec doesn't even show up until you look at number 27, with their contestant, yikes. Of course, it's one that's impossible to pronounce, Ville-Marie, le Sud-Ouest, Île-des-Sœurs. Moving back to Alberta, look at some of these monstrosities. Calgary Skyview, oh geez, population 160,000, seat count 1. Calgary Shepherd, population 163,000, seat count 1. And remember how all of PEI's seats are under 40,000? That means 1 Islanders vote is equal to 4 Calgarian votes. Yeah, you know what, maybe Alberta does get to complain a little bit from time to time. But the one that takes the cake, the worst one of all, it's so out of whack, I need to warn you beforehand to please turn off this video if you frighten easily. This is your warning. Behold, Edmonton, Wetaskiwin. Wetaskiwin? Okay, I don't know, but look, population in 2021, 209,000. Oh, disgusting. That means that if you live there, your vote in the last 2 elections, and probably the next one, will count for 1/8 of that of someone living in Labrador. If you know anybody who lives there, please call them and let them know. It will get better in 2024 or after that. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen, the perfect plan to win our majority and become PM by winning the least populous ridings only. Interestingly enough, my government will be one of the most representative geographically, with seats in every province and territory, which surprisingly is something that's only happened 5 times since 1953. My government will also have a strong mix of both northern and southern rural ridings, as well as ridings in all the major cities. Look, we got seats in Vancouver, Calgary, Saskatoon, Regina, Edmonton, Winnipeg. Okay, that doesn't count KW. Hamilton, sorry, not you, London, Niagara, Windsor, or Victoria. I don't know why you guys got ignored. Look, we even got seats throughout Toronto and the GTA. And quite a few in Montreal. I mean, it's Quebec, so what did you expect? And oof, for some reason we completely snubbed Ottawa. Oh well. And yeah, we also kind of snubbed Mississauga. But you know, it's pretty much standard at this point. But of course, this is all just a fantasy. In order to make this a reality, I'd have to win the votes of Islanders who normally vote Liberal, rural Quebecers who tend to vote for the Bloc Québécois, Northern Ontarians who normally back the NDP, and rural Albertans who vote Conservative. Again, this whole thing is mainly just a thought exercise as well as a retrospective on the 2019 and 2021 elections. But going back to the main question we started with, how many votes do we need? Like actually, how many pieces of paper with an X next to the names of the people that have pledged their undying support for me do we need? Well, the population of the 170 seats is only 16 million, or 43% of the population. Okay, wait, but how do we get to 5% from here? Okay, shh, I'll get there. See, back in 2021, only 3/4 of the population was registered to vote. So if we assume that they are spread out evenly, well then that drops us down to only 12 million registered voters in our 170 specifically chosen ridings. And then when you consider that in order to lock up a seat you only need half plus one of those votes, then boom, down to 6 million. Except then somebody will note that not everybody shows up to vote. 50% isn't that unrealistic in our country anymore, unfortunately. So look at that, 3 million votes are all we need to secure our majority. With a majority of the votes in each of the 170 specifically targeted ridings, that's exactly 8% of Canada's population. Now this is the part where the nerds in the back point out that Canada is not in fact a two-party system, despite what the list of my predecessors would suggest. 1 in 3 don't vote for either of the two big parties. If we factor this in and incorrectly assume it distributes evenly across our 170 ridings, then we only need a little over 5% to give us our majority. Imagine that! 5% to have absolute power in Parliament, and therefore the government as a whole. Except for the pesky Supreme Court, I guess. For now, at least. Even though I could probably change that if I was in charge. Ah, democracy. I love it. Now that you're done with this nonsense, click here to see how I can become Prime Minister with 0% of the votes.